Thank you very much for the opportunity to address you today on behalf of the International Chamber of Commerce. We are the institutional representative of more than 45 million businesses worldwide. Friends, less than 12 months ago, many observers were predicting an end to globalization itself. The pandemic disrupted supply chains and investment flows dried up. Governments, suddenly confronted with the resulting vulnerabilities and dependencies, encouraged what they called reshoring, production of critical goods, and it was anything but certain that science could deliver us the tools to break the back of COVID-19. But today, the outlook is actually brighter. There is little indication of a sustained movement away from global supply chains. Businesses showed remarkable ingenuity in responding to difficult circumstances, and the private sector, yes, developed vaccines and treatments at record pace. All with the result that global trade will actually rebound significantly by the end of 2021 and more than offset last year's precipitous decline. But my friends, there are still challenges to trade, to investment, and to our systems of economic governance. In trade in recent months, many businesses in our network have suffered production outages or sales shortfalls due to disruptions in supply. Rising transport costs risk further stoking inflationary pressures in advanced economies in particular, translating into punitive cost of living increases for hard-pressed families. And business and governments together need to face up to the investments needed to boost shipping capacity over the medium term. We need supply networks to learn the real lessons of this crisis and find their new normal. But the real answers will not be found in the chimera of reshoring, which in reality is nothing more than a form of populist protectionism, which only concentrates risk and increases prices for consumers. The investment picture, however, is much more worrying. Naturally, the pandemic had a greater impact on investment than trade. After all, transporting goods around the world requires little physical human interaction. But acquiring a firm or establishing a new production facility in another country actually requires travel, often to meet potential partners and in many cases close contacts with foreign governments to obtain the permits necessary for the investment. Pandemic-induced border closures and travel restrictions have obviously made this much more difficult. Accordingly, governments wishing to increase investment flows must prioritize breaking the back of this pandemic and safely reopening borders and economies. Fundamentally, that requires getting vaccines, tests, and treatments distributed equitably around the world as quickly as possible. And that is why the global business community, and ICC in particular, calls on governments to fully and immediately fund the ACT Accelerator to enable those vaccines to flow, not as an act of charity, but as a first-order investment priority. But the business community is not only concerned with how to increase the quantity of investment, but how to get the right quality investment that will enable us to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Because the reality is that around $6.3 trillion worth of infrastructure investment is required each year up to 2030 to meet development goals, and a significant proportion of this will have to come from the private sector, be it companies, financial institutions, banks, or long-term investors such as pension funds. Doing this requires creating the right incentives for the private sector to shift funds into sustainable investments. Above all, governments must get the investment climate right, which, for business, means predictability, transparency, and efficiency, as they seek to assess and mitigate their risks when investing abroad. Our ICC investment guidelines set out principles for both investors and governments on a range of issues, from ownership and management, finance, fiscal policies, to anti-corruption and technology. And I encourage all governments to adopt these principles as a means of encouraging responsible and sustainable investments in our post-COVID and hopefully very post-COVID world. There is also much more that can be done. We need to support the development of ESG and impact investing through truly global harmonized regulations, metrics and reporting standards. And we need governments to improve the attractiveness of sustainable investment projects and bring in the private sector through public-private partnerships. Finally, governments must not only get their domestic policy settings right, but they must also tend more to the multilateral trading system in which we all operate. For too long, governments have taken trade rules with the WTO at its centre for granted. Business has heard much rhetoric on the need for reform from politicians, but has seen very little action. Every year, ministers profess commitment to the system, but ultimately shy away from making any compromises or concessions that enable agreement. As a result now, 2 months out from the next WTO ministerial conference, the world looks set to simply roll over today's problems to tomorrow. Business looks at this situation and says this is just not good enough. The WTO and its ability to write rules and adjudicate disputes matters deeply to global business everywhere in the world, and business is looking to ministers for leadership. Don't shy away. We want your ambition. We want you to compromise where necessary and to make the decisions that the national interest is actually served by preserving and enhancing the world trading system. If we do not do that, the WTO continues to ossify and will become less relevant by the day. And that, let me be clear, is not what business wants or needs. To conclude, boosting investment requires successfully fighting COVID-19, getting the fundamental domestic settings right, and strengthening the multilateral trading system. But we also need to ensure investments help drive sustainable development, which we can only do if we create incentives for the private sector to allow its funds to flow in that direction, and if the public and private sectors work together effectively to design these systems. That's collaboration. I wish you a great World Investment Forum from the International Chamber of Commerce.